Shalom and welcome to Temple Talk. This is Yitzhak Reuven speaking to you from south of Jerusalem here in the holy, beautiful land of Israel. Today is the 7th day of the month of Tevet, 5785. It's January 7th, 2025. This coming Shabbat we read the final portion, the final parashah, the final Torah reading of the book of Genesis, known as Vayechi, and he lived, and Yaakov lived. We'll be talking about that in a few minutes. It begins in the book of Genesis, chapter 47, verse 28, and concludes chapter 50, verse 26. And before Shabbat, in fact, beginning tomorrow, Wednesday, actually Tuesday evening, are 3 days. 3 days in the month of Tevet that once were each observed by certain people, by very pious people, as fast days. Dawn to dark fast days, but nevertheless, in a certain time in our history, certain pious people would fast from dawn to dusk each of those 3 days, and those 3 days are the 8th is the day that the Torah was translated for the first time into a language other than Hebrew, and it was translated into Greek. In what was known as the Septuagint. We'll talk about that in a few minutes, and why that was a day that is seen as a sad day, a day for fasting in Israel. And the 9th of Tevet is the day of the passing of both Ezra and Nechemiah, the two Jewish leaders who led Jews out of the Babylonian exile. A relatively small number of Jews they led out back to Jerusalem, where they reestablished a community of Jews after they had been exiled following the destruction of the first temple. And Ezra, extremely important figure in our Jewish history and our Jewish identity, because he basically revived our traditions and rededicated the community that had gone with him to Jerusalem to the commandments of the Torah, because people had strayed in the exile and people had forgotten, and he realigned us. He set us back on the right path. And extremely important figure, as was Nehemiah, and they both went to the next world on this day. So that was a day of sadness for Israel. And the 10th is the one day that we still, in modern times, we still observe as a fast. And that will be this Friday. That's the 10th of Tevet, Asura B'Tevet. And that marks the day that the Babylonians first breached the walls of the city of Jerusalem, and beginning a 3-year siege, which ultimately ended with them. They laid a siege. I should say they laid siege on Jerusalem on the 10th of Tevet, and after 3 years they finally breached the walls. And on the 17th of Tammuz, another fast day, is when they actually breached and entered into the city. And it was 3 weeks later, on the 9th of Av, that they destroyed the first holy temple built by King Solomon. And so those are the 3 days that we are about to be observing. And the fast, again, of the 3 days, only the fast of Tevet is a fast day in modern times. In fact, in most of the history of Israel, it seemed to be a certain period where certain very pious people would fast all 3 days. But the fast of Tevet, which is one of the 4 fasts that were established by Zechariah, who mentions it, the 4 days in his prophecy when we read it, observing the destruction of the first holy temple, and also the assassination of Gedaliah, who was the first governor appointed by the Babylonians to reestablish some sort of autonomy or local self-rule in Jerusalem for the Jews, and he was assassinated, which basically put an end to those aspirations. So those are the 4 fast days. it happens to be that of all the fast days that we observe, including Yom Kippur, only the 10th of Tevet will ever fall out on a Friday. It's if any other fast falls out on a Friday, whether it's one of those 4 fasts or Yom Kippur. Yom Kippur would never fall out on a Friday to begin with. Any other of those fasts, including Ta'anit Esther, the fast of Esther, which we observe the day before we celebrate Purim, it would either be moved ahead to a Thursday or pushed off till Sunday, till Yom Rishon. Only the fast of the 10th of Tammuz, the 10th of Tevet, is observed when it lands on a Friday, is observed on a Friday. And of course, it's the shortest of all the fasts in Israel because it comes here in the heart of the winter months. And so the days are short. And so since it's only a fast from the rising of the sun to the setting of the sun, it is the shortest. But on a year where it falls on a Friday, as it does this year, we have to make special preparations for bringing in the Shabbat, and we don't eat all day until we actually make Kiddush, until we sanctify the Shabbat before a meal on Friday night. And so the first thing that passes through our lips following the fast of the 10th of Tevet that falls on a Friday is the wine with which we bless the Shabbat. So again, what's so tragic about translating the Torah into Greek? Now, today we know that the Torah is translated into many languages, and that seems to be like a blessing. And more people can learn it, and people that don't know Hebrew can learn it. And that means Jews and non-Jews that don't know Hebrew can study the Torah, and that's a wonderful thing. So why has it been frowned upon traditionally? Well, let's first talk about the story. And it's mentioned in Torah and in Talmud tractate Megillah, and it says 9 Aleph, it says Tesha Aleph. It says, it happened when King Ptolemy, now remember that King Ptolemy was a line of kings that followed Alexander. After Alexander died and his empire was divided among his generals, you know about the generals of the Seleucids, who were the ones of the Hanukkah story, Antiochus of the Hanukkah story. Well, Egypt was ruled by the family of generals under the name of Ptolemy. In fact, Cleopatra was the last of the Ptolemaic rulers of Egypt. They were not part of the original line of pharaohs. They were Greek in origin. So let's read what the tractate Megillah says. It happened when King Ptolemy that he gathered 72 elders and gathered them in 72 houses and did not reveal to them the purpose for which he had gathered them. And he went to visit each of them one by one, and he said to them, "Write for me the Torah of Moshe your teacher, the Holy One who is blessed. The Holy One who is blessed gave to the heart of each of them one by one wisdom, and all of them arrived at a single understanding." So what the Talmud is telling us is that King Ptolemy wanted the Torah to be translated into Greek. Ostensibly, he wanted to add it to the great library of Alexandria, which we know of, which was burned down, and all that was lost in it. But at the time, Alexandria was a large city, and it had a very, very large Jewish population, many Jews who had either been exiled and left for Egypt or had fled, whether they fled the Persians or whatever during different wars. Over time, they ended up in Alexandria. And in any case, King Ptolemy wanted this translated into Greek, because that was the language that was being spoken by the people at the time. And so he ordered, he had, it was hard to, the rabbis, the sages could not demur, they could not say no thanks. He ordered them to gather, and he put each one in a separate room, and without telling them what they were there for. And then he went to each one of them separately, and he said, each one had a Torah scroll with them, and he said, I want you to translate the Torah into Greek. And so each one was told separately, and none of them were aware of what the others were writing or how they were translating. Now, you have to understand that translating anything into another language is no easy task, and translating the Torah is practically an impossible task, because the words have deep meanings. They have, a single word may have more than one meanings. It can be read in different ways. So each rabbi, each sage had to make a decision, the best way to translate, to get the most meaning, to be truest to the original intention. Any mistake, slight mistake, could lead people astray, and it could lead people to instead of teaching them about the one true God, it could lead to a misunderstanding, and people would say, "What are you talking about? You have gods here. You have more than one God, or why does God say this when God didn't say that?" You have to be super, super careful, even in the very first words, even the very first verse of the Torah. So each one was given a certain amount of time, and each one translated on their own the entire 5 books of Moses and presented it with Ptolemy, and miracle of miracles, each one was identical to the other. So this was a great miracle, because God gave them Ruach HaKodesh. He gave them the spirit of prophecy, gave them wisdom so that they could do this. So making it accessible to many other people, the Torah. So what was bad? What was the downside of this? The downside is that you can't possibly make a how should I say it? Foolproof translation of the Torah with all of its depth, with all of the meaning. That the Hebrew language is unique, and it's just different from other languages, and the way it's used in the Torah is different even from the way it's used in other books of the Tanakh and other books of the Hebrew scriptures. And so it's every translation, every word you have to weigh what's the best way to translate this word. And as you know, in English, for example, in our day, there are many different translations. There are many different translations by scholarly Jewish sources today. And the Chabad translation into English differs from the Art Scroll translation, etc., etc. They're all proper translations, but each one is trying to reveal a different facet of what the Torah is trying to tell us. So it's a very difficult task, and it can and has led to people taking it that don't understand the original Hebrew and misinterpreting it and drawing conclusions that are incorrect. So that is the downside of the translation into Greek. Despite the fact that there was a miraculous side to it, there was also a downside. So that's always been something that traditionally Jews have sort of harumphed about. Now, you should know that the word Septuagint, which exists to this day and is a sacred text, and has much to recommend it, because it does reveal many insights that those rabbis were trying to convey. And the word Septuagint is from the word 70 in Greek, Shiva'im in Hebrew, and that refers to the 70 elders, the 70 sages who translated it into Greek. So, and that was I believe in the maybe the first century BCE, that time period. Again, when Alexandria was a great cosmopolitan city, and there were many Jews there, and there was a lot of religious ferment in 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 Israel and in Egypt at the time, and this was part of a lot that was going on um, throughout the area. And the ninth, as I mentioned, is the date of the passing of Ezra and Nechemiah. And again, in short, the prophet Jeremiah, he prophesied that Jews would return back to Israel, back to Jerusalem, after a 70-year period of exile in Babylon. And indeed they did, but only a very, very small portion of the Jews, most of the Jews, the vast majority of the Jews, stayed in Babylon, where they established, or had established during those first 70 years, a community and a scholarly tradition that would be supreme in our history for hundreds of years. The Babylonian Talmud was composed there, and the sages and the Gaonim, the sages of the 9th and 10th century CE, were all sat in there in Babylon, and the Babylonian Jews, the community existed right up until modern times, right up until after the establishment of the state of Israel, when the newly established independent state of Iraq, a product of the division into states by the British and the French after they occupied the Middle East following their victory in World War I. The Iraqi government killed many Jews. There were riots and there were slaughters, massacres, and they arrested and put in prison many Jews. And they told Jews, they took all their possessions, all their wealth, and said, get out. And so the one country where they could go to that was accepting them was the newly established state of Israel. And Israel was comprised of about 600,000 citizens at the time, and a massive influx of Jews from Iraq, Babylonian Jews that had been for 2,600 years in Iraq, before it was called Iraq, a very, very well-established community in business, in education, and certainly in Torah tradition, and also in music. The much of the popular music culture in Iraq was Jewish, so they all moved to Israel. That's the conclusion of the Babylonian exile, a community that existed for 2,600 years, and were forced out with none of their possessions, and made their home in Israel, where the vast majority of Iraqi Jews live today in Israel, and are very, very important parts of the makeup of the people of Israel today. So that is Ezra and Nehemiah. But again, we can't possibly discuss the importance of Ezra in our history, but he was considered to be a second Moses, because he basically took people and he reestablished the primacy of Torah observance. He and Nehemiah had the walls. Jerusalem was a ruin. The walls were destroyed. They rebuilt the walls of Jerusalem for security, and then of course rebuilt the altar, so they could begin renewing the daily offerings. And then, despite much political opposition and intrigue over the next few decades, succeeded finally in building the second Holy Temple, and which would last for nearly 500 years before it was destroyed by the Romans. But Ezra was super, super, super important in bringing us back to the path of Moshe, our master. And of course, the 10th of Tevet, which, as we know, is as I mentioned, was the beginning of the Babylonian siege of Jerusalem, a siege which lasted 3 years before the Babylonian army finally succeeded in breaching the walls, because it took them that long to break through the stone walls of the city of Jerusalem, after which the army poured into the city and killed and exiled many of the Jews of Jerusalem, and of course plundered and then destroyed the Holy Temple. So this coming Friday, we will be observing a fast, and as I said before, that fast will end on Shabbat as we make the Kiddush, the sanctification, the blessing that sanctifies Shabbat before our evening meal on Friday night. Let us now segue over to Parshat Vayechi, and he lived is what Vayechi means. Let's read the first few verses in Hebrew, then in English. Once again, we are in the book of Genesis, chapter 47, verse 28. And again, this is the concluding reading of the book of Genesis. Next week, we'll begin the book of Exodus, Shemot in Hebrew. And so this concludes the saga of the family of Yaakov and his sons, Yosef and his brothers. It concludes the saga of the three patriarchs, Avraham, Yitzhak, and Yaakov. And it concludes the drama of brothers not getting along very well, beginning with the first two brothers that ever set foot on earth, and those being Cain and Abel. And we know the story there. And even the brothers, the sons of the patriarchs, whether it be Yitzhak and Ishmael, or Yaakov and Esav, or Yosef and his brothers, they were not getting along. So as we've talked about before, and we won't go into it again, God had to do something in order to wake people up and sort of place the brothers in a position where they would have to be their better selves and realize the importance of brotherly love and unity. So that's what this is all about. And of course that took place in last week's Parsha, Vayigash, when the brothers when Yosef finally revealed himself to his brothers, and who were ready to go to war in order to protect their little brother Binyamin, which was a signal to Yosef that they had changed their ways. That's when he revealed himself to them. But this week we're going to read again chapter 47, verse 28. Vayechi Yaakov be'eretz Mitzrayim 17 shana, vahi yemei Yaakov shnei chayav 7 shanim ve'arba'im ma'at shana. ויקרבו ימי ישראל למות, ויקרא לבנו ליוסף, ויאמר לו, אם נא מצאתי חן בעיניך, שים נא ידך תחת ירכי, ועשית עמדי חסד ואמת, אל נא תקברני במצרים. ושכבתי עם אבותי, ונשאתני ממצרים, וקברתני בקבורתם, ויאמר אנוכי אעשה כדבריך. Yaakov lived in the land of Egypt 17 years. In the days of Yaakov, the years of his life were 147 years. The time approached for Israel to die. So he called for his son, for Yosef, and said to him, Please, if I have found favor in your eyes, please place your hand under my thigh, and do kindness and truth with me. Please do not bury me in Egypt, for I will lie with my fathers, and you shall transport me out of Egypt and bury me in their tomb. He said, Yosef said, I personally will do as you have said. He said, Swear to me, and he swore to him. Then Israel prostrated himself towards the head of the bed. Okay, Yaakov, his life is coming to an end. and his total years, we are told, are 147. And he lived in the land of Egypt for 17 years. We know because when Yaakov was first introduced to Pharaoh, Pharaoh said, "How old are you, old man?" And Yaakov said, "I'm 130 years old. I've had a tough life. I've had a bitter life. I'm not going to attain the age of my father or my grandfather." He was really, he asked someone like, "How are you?" and they tell you the truth. Sometimes it's not really what you wanted to hear. You really didn't mean it. You're just supposed to say, I'm fine, how are you? But yeah, Yaakov went on and on telling him about his troubles. And indeed, he had a very troubled life. He had a very difficult life, much more difficult than Abraham or Yitzhak. Abraham had many, many, many challenges. But he met them head on without complications, without personal complications. He had some complications. His wife Sarah had some difficulties with Hagar and with Ishmael, which gave much pain, caused much pain for Abraham. But Abraham he seemed to be on top of his game. He seemed to be able to rise above whatever might be happening around him. He had to go to war. He had to perform the Akedah. He was told to offer up his son. That was tremendous challenge, but he did it head on, and he worked through it. So again, he had super challenges. He had 10 tests, 10 trials that Hashem tested him with. Challenges that Shelo Neda, as we say in Hebrew, we should never know them. They were so difficult. But his life was I'm trying to find the right way to express it. His life was clear of intrigues. Yaakov's life was full of intrigue. Now, before we talk about that, Yitzhak had a very quiet life. He was very successful. He had a very, very dynamic wife. He had two sons, and while there was much between them that wasn't so good. Nevertheless, they grew up. They grew up together, and Yitzhak loved Esav, and Rivka loved Yaakov, and they loved them both, each of them. But they each had their favorite, the one that they thought should lead the next generation. And he ended up blessing both his sons. And yes, he went blind, and Yaakov tricked him. But he had a pretty sedentary life, a successful life. He never left the land of Israel, land of Canaan. Yaakov, of course, life was full of intrigue, full of angst. He had to flee from his brother. He lived much of his life outside of the land of Israel. He wanted to marry one girl that he fell in love with. He ended up having 4 wives, which was a difficulty. He had a father-in-law who was very difficult and a deceptive person. And when he came back into the land, he had to meet up with Esav. Okay, that went okay. Then Dinah, his daughter, was raped. And then his 2 sons, Shimon and Levi, killed an entire city. And then, of course, the whole story of Yosef and his brothers and Yaakov being led to believe that Yosef was dead. He had a very, very, very difficult life. And, of course, he lived out his life, not in Canaan, not in the land that was promised to him through his fathers, but in Egypt. Now, we're told, our sages say, because the word Vayichi, Shva Esrei, 17. He lived 17 years in the land of Egypt. Shva Esrei also, 17 is the gematria, the numerical value of the word tov, meaning good. So our sages learn out from this that these were his best years of his life. These were the happiest years, and it makes sense. His sons had finally gotten together and decided to forgive their past and not be jealous anymore and get along. And his son Yosef was basically the vice president of Egypt. Pretty impressive. And they were living in a land that's Goshen, where they were untroubled by hostile neighbors, it was a good land for grazing sheep. It was good. These 17 years were good years for Yaakov. However, when his time came, the first thing he told his son Yosef was, don't bury me here. This is not my place. I don't belong here. And I always find it very significant that just before he dies, we're told that he picked up his legs and drew them into the bed where he was lying, and that was his last act before he died. Yes, in chapter 49, verse 33, when Yaakov finished instructing his sons, he drew his feet onto the bed. He expired and was gathered to his people. Meaning, it seems to me it's almost like an act of intent. I'll die in this bed, but I'm not dying. I'm not going to die with any physical connection to this land, because it's not my land. And of course, he was told by God on the way down to Egypt, when he went 17 years earlier to meet Yosef, he was told by God in a dream in Beersheba, after Yaakov built an altar and made offerings to Hashem, he was told, don't worry, you're going down into Egypt, everything's going to be good, and your children eventually will be brought back. I'll bring them back up out of Egypt to the land that I promised to Abraham, to Yitzhak, and to you. So he knew that the future would be bright, and on the one hand, he wanted to be part of that. He didn't want to be, left behind, as we'll see also Yosef, just before he dies in the concluding verses of Genesis. He also doesn't want to be left behind, and he tells his brothers, you will take my bones when you go up out of here. You'll carry my bones up out of here and bury me in Canaan, in the land of Israel. And so on the one hand, Yaakov doesn't want to be left behind. On the other hand, I think he also sees it's his responsibility to ensure that he will be buried with his fathers in the Machpelah, because that was a hugely symbolic place, because that's where Avraham, the first piece of land that Avraham purchased, and he purchased it as a burial place for Sarah, his wife, and that basically was setting down roots in the land, roots that cannot be severed ever. And as Yaakov points out to his sons, that's where Avraham and Sarah are buried. That's where Yitzhak and Rivka are buried, and that's where Yaakov buried his wife Leah. And so Yaakov wants to be buried with them, and he wants to be part of those roots, of that important physical, not just a symbol, but a physical hold on the land. And also it's instructive for his children that whatever it takes, that's where we're going. And I'm going to be up there, and you're going to join me, or your children will join me one day, because that is the land that God promised us. So this was hugely, hugely important to Yaakov, and hugely important to our history and to the children of Israel from that moment forth. And to this day, the Machpelah is visited. And now, since the time of Herod, it has a huge building, a structure built over it. So we don't actually go into the caves below, although they have been explored. And but it is a place of pilgrimage for Jews, also a place of pilgrimage for Muslims, because Avraham is also the father of the Muslims. I'm hearing the music. So again, we conclude the book of Genesis with Parshat Vayechi, the death of Yaakov, and soon after the death of Yosef, and what will begin next week in the book of Exodus with the enslavement of Israel in Egypt. Thank you so much for being with me. Temple Talk.